In the Canadian North, there is a place that has been shrouded in mystery and legend for centuries. Long before Europeans came to the area, the Dene had stories of the people who inhabited that area, the Naha, a nation of cannibals. There are legends of a tropical part of the valley, lush with vegetation, monsters that live in the caves that line the valley. It is also said to be the home of the legendary wolf bear, a ferocious animal that hunts for sport. And there are tales told of a race of diminutive humanoids, still very primitive in their culture. The pure natural beauty of the valley, well actually 4 canyons all connected by the river, had it been named one of the first UNESCO World Heritage Sites. It is where famed historian Pierre Berton had his first big break as a journalist. Flora and fauna not seen anywhere else in Canada live between the walls of the canyons. Hot springs change the climate in ways not seen in other places. A protected site, roughly 1,000 visitors see it each year. Yet there are still mysteries that have yet to be solved. It is the Nahanni Valley in the Northwest Territory. Throughout the history of Canada, certain events are always highlighted and are well enshrined in our collective memory. Be it the War of 1812, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the creation of Canada in 1867, or the 1972 Summit Series. And while much of the history of Canada is solidly rooted in fact, there are a number of stories which leave more questions than answers. There is a part of the history of Canada, even the land before Canada as a country existed, that are mysteries, legends, myths, and stories that shiver the soul. These stories are just as important as the ones we all know about, and we will be telling one of those stories today. Welcome to Canadian History After Dark. The stories about the Nahanni Valley are numerous. The legends date back literally hundreds of years. The name of the area itself comes from the Dene people of the region. They called the valley na-dene, meaning area of the Naha people. There have been mysterious disappearances and deaths in the region as recently as this century, and even this decade. I do want to say at the start of this week's episode, the book Legends of the Nahanni Valley, written by Hammerson Peters, has been an invaluable asset for research, and I would love to have him on as a guest at some point in time. In addition to this book, he has done a lot of great work cataloging the mysteries of Canada. This could also end up being perhaps the first time we cover a subject over the course of 2 or more episodes on Canadian History After Dark. There is just so much to be talked about when it comes to this fascinating place. We can start off with a look at the geography of the region. And this is something that I think is very important to understanding the legends. This being a podcast, it can sometimes be tough to properly illustrate with words what we are looking at, but I will do my best to paint a picture. If you want a great resource to use while listening to the podcast, I recommend checking out the website atlas.digitalhistory.ca. It is a great resource for learning more about Canadian history with an interactive map. Now, many of the rivers and features of the area have traditional Dene names as well as English names. For this podcast, I'll be using the English names to help prevent confusion in terms of referencing maps and such. This is not meant to be a slight to Dene speakers at all. Rather, I don't want to risk offending anyone by mispronouncing a language I'm not familiar with. So where is the Nahanni Valley? Well, it is in the Nahanni National Park Reserve near the Mackenzie Mountains. To give a bit more of a location, it is just inside the border of Northwest Territory from Yukon Territory and northwest of Fort Nelson in British Columbia. The South Nahanni River, which flows through the park, meets up with the Liard River at Nahanni Butte, and the Liard then flows into Great Slave Lake. The part of the park which is most known for its mysteries are the 4 canyons which line the river. The names of the canyons are quite simple: First, Second, Third, and Fourth Canyons. Much of the rocky crags seen along the park are hundreds of million years old, protected in part by the Mackenzie Mountains. The most recent ice age only really affected the edges of the valley, leaving much of it untouched. The river that runs through the valley is known as an antecedent river. This means that it hasn't changed its course over the years. The mountains rose slowly, and the river is powerful. This means that with an unchanged course, the river was able to carve a path from the Moose Ponds, where it originates, to its confluence with the Liard. As for the canyons themselves, we will go to how they are described by Parks Canada. Quote, Virginia Falls is where the South Nahanni River picks up speed, transforming from a wide, placid river to a raging torrent which plunges in a spectacular curtain over a vertical drop of 92 meters. The falls are divided by a central rock stack, which has resisted erosion as the falls migrated upstream. The gradual erosion of the falls created Fourth Canyon, the first of a series of 4 spectacular deep canyons downstream. Downstream of Fourth Canyon is Third Canyon, a 40-kilometer stretch which gashes through the mountains of the Funeral Range. Its long colluvial slopes are a mixed strata of shales, sandstones, and limestones. Key features of Third Canyon include the Gate, where the river makes a sharp hairpin turn and squeezes through a narrow gap flanked by a vertical limestone that is 460 meters high, and Pulpit Rock, a distinctive pinnacle seen on the east side of the gap. At Second Canyon, the South Nahanni River bisects another mountain range, the Headless Range. This section is only 15 kilometers long and leads into Dead Men Valley. Beyond Dead Men Valley lies First Canyon, the most spectacular of the 4 canyons. Here, the Nahanni River has cut through the resistant limestone, creating the highest and most awe-inspiring vertical canyon walls in the park. Unquote. The area is also home to a number of hot springs. This includes the Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs and the Krause Hot Springs. The Rabbit Kettle area is warmed by volcanic energy from deep underneath the Earth's surface. The springs keep the water in the area around 20 degrees Celsius year-round. There are also a number of tufa mounds created by the precipitation of minerals such as calcium carbonate. These mounds are extremely fragile and very old. Visiting them is actually quite limited. One of the mounds, the North Mound, is thought to be over 10,000 years old. These springs hold a special meaning for the Dene people. Gifts have been left at the springs for good luck, and it is said that good luck will come to the Dene people if the kettle is overflowing. The Krause Hot Springs are fed by 2 thermal water sources, but are high in levels of hydrogen sulfide. This has prevented the formation of tufa over the years. The wildlife of the valley is extremely diverse. Black and grizzly bears live in the area, along with wolves, moose, and caribou. There have been wolverines seen there, as well as smaller animals like mink, marten, otter, lynx, and red fox. Dall's sheep call the park home, as do some other mountain goats from time to time. Over 180 bird species have been reported in the valley, including some raptors like peregrine falcons. There are no reptiles known to live in the valley, likely owing to the climate, but fish are plentiful. This includes things like lake trout, northern pike, and mountain whitefish. The area has long been inhabited by the Dene people, going back thousands of years. The oral histories of the Dene have helped to paint a picture of what life was like here well before Europeans ever came to see the valley. These oral histories have been supported by archaeological findings over the years as well. The Dene have long called the Dehcho region home, and this includes the Mackenzie River, but it didn't always include parts of the Nahanni Valley. We will get to that shortly. The Dene followed the migratory patterns of animals and traveled in smaller extended family groups. They would get together, these family groups, a few times a year and have large celebrations, including fire-feeding ceremonies, hand games, dancing, and more. The Dene, who by all accounts were a relatively peaceful people, lived alongside the Naha. The legends state the Naha were essentially a nomadic people who worshipped the spirit Nindabadza. They would leave gifts for their protector at the Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs. They would also live in the many caves that line the valley. Some stories even say they kept a settlement where the Prairie Creek flows into the South Nahanni River. The Naha are said to have been very well equipped for being warlike. The warriors wore cuirasses made from wooden dowels that were cinched with sinew. They carried wooden shields and had stone knives, axes, spears, clubs. When attacking, they would torture the prisoners, mutilate the dead, kill the children, and take the women into the mountains. This would go on for years. Then eventually, the Dene had enough. We go to the Legends of the Nahanni Valley by Hammerson Peters. Quote, after suffering a number of devastating incursions, a party of Dene braves took to the warpath, traveling into Nahanni country with the intention of pillaging a Naha camp. In time, the warriors came upon a scattering of teepees and prepared to attack. Upon rushing the camp with their weapons at hand, however, the Dene discovered that their enemies were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. With all the campfire tales of evil spirits and giant cannibals swiftly recalled to mind, the Dene warriors fled to the country, beating a fearful retreat back to the lowlands. They never saw the Naha again. Unquote. So where did the Naha go? This is where the theories, which are numerous, come in. We will start with the disease theory. This one was put forward in 1946 by Donald Carroll, a member of the United States Geological Survey. He posited that the Naha were wiped out by a very virulent strain of Staphylococcus meningitis. This theory, according to Peters' book, would be an explanation for the Dene legend about the Sonatea, an evil spirit that killed men with disease. Carroll suggested that this disease was introduced to the area by Russian trappers from Alaska, and that when the Dene found the remains of the villages of their enemy, they believed an evil spirit had killed them. As a result, the Dene would give a wide berth, avoiding much of the valley so they wouldn't have to deal with being killed by the evil spirits themselves. Carroll wrote, quote, the half-ruined stone huts are still standing, and whoever takes shelter in them contracts the extremely infectious disease. The bacteria is of the type which can remain dormant for considerable time. It appears that when trappers, hunters, and prospectors were in the region, they naturally sought shelter of the huts which were still standing. The warmth of the campfires would quickly rouse the bacteria from its dormant state. Unquote. Now, there were some reports that doctors and other scientists had gone to the valley to test this claim, but there's no other information to be found from it other than that they went. Now, another theory is that the Naha didn't go anywhere. Rather, they are the ancestors of the Nahanni people who would inhabit the valley until the 1800s, before the Dene, fed up with constant attacks, drove them out of the valley. There is one possible explanation for the disappearance of the Naha people, which has fascinated several, and it helps to explain why an Athabascan or na-dene language is spoken in the American Southwest, while so many of the other nations in that area speak languages of the Uto-Aztecan and Algic families. This theory is that the Naha simply left to find a new home. Their journey would take them 2,000 miles to the south, where they would become the Navajo. The Navajo language is similar enough to the Dene languages of the subarctic that it is said those who speak Dene can converse with the Navajo quite easily. While someone reading the facts could even speculate the name Navajo is close, at least to the English ear, to Naha, this isn't the case. Navajo was a name used by the Spanish to denote the people of the area, adopting a Pueblo word. The word the Navajo used for themselves, Dene, or people. Archaeological evidence shows the Navajo and their ancestors came from the north, around 1100 Common Era. This doesn't necessarily line up with the timelines of the oral histories, but at the same time, it is hard to date an oral history. As for other archaeological evidence of the Naha in the valley, over the years, much has been seen in the way of arrowheads, artifacts, and even bones that show the valley was inhabited as far back as 6,000 years ago. The Naha people were real. The mystery is, where did they go? The Naha aren't the only ones said to have inhabited the valley. In fact, there are stories told of someone or something that calls the valley and the caves that line it home to this day. The Nakani. The Nakani would best be described as a creature similar in legend to that of the Sasquatch or Yeti, living in the areas from the Mackenzie River to Alaska. The fear that the Nakani puts into people is very real. There are stories of entire encampments being abandoned to take shelter on an island in a lake because a Nakani was believed to be nearby, or of everyone firing a musket into the woods to scare off the creature. Many of the nations in the north have different names for the creature, but the descriptions of it were always very similar. Giants with red eyes, long muscular arms, looking almost human-like, and liking to eat human flesh. Emerson Peters adds more in the Legends of the Nahanni Valley, quote, "Many frontiersmen wrote about the incredible size of this creature's footprints, which they left behind in the snow and muskeg. Their tracks were purportedly man-like in appearance, yet much longer and narrower. In some accounts, their big toe stood out from the remaining four. Although their footprints never bore any nail marks, some said that the Nakani's fingers were tipped with long, nail-like claws." Unquote. The Nakani was said to be most active during the spring and the summer. In the winter, they would retreat to hibernate. Where was never known, but some thought perhaps the caves of the Nahanni Valley, while others believed they migrated south. So what was the Nakani really? Where did this mythical creature come from? Some anthropologists attribute the legends of the Nakani to those who have become separate from their nation, whether exiled due to abhorrent behavior such as murder and cannibalism, or becoming lost in the wilderness and forgetting what it is to be human. We go back to Emerson Peters, quote, "As a result of their hard life in the bush and the separation from society, they acquired a frightening, grotesque appearance. Their faces were gaunt, and their bodies emaciated on account of malnutrition. Their skin was often caked with filth and grease, their hair unkempt, and their clothing worn and ragged. Oftentimes their outfits were strange or incomplete. One knife-wielding Nakani, for example, was said to have been wearing nothing more than hard-soled shoes made from untanned hide and a headscarf. Others were purported to wear strange boots, which could not be purchased at any trading post in the region." Unquote. Any embellishment that would make the Nakani less human are often dismissed by academics, noting that it is part of how legends develop over the years, kind of like the game of telephone, but lasting for generations and generations. Each storyteller adds a little bit, takes out something that doesn't work for their audience until you get to their current description. There is an argument that the Nakani is a cryptid, that is, an animal that exists but has been never proven to exist. Think the Sasquatch or Ogopogo or the Yeti. Those who argue that the Nakani is a cryptid suggest it is part of a group of people who have survived since the Denisovan days, never emerging from the valley and never developing technology over thousands and thousands of years. Others argue that the Nakani is related to the other wild man-type cryptids from around the world, Sasquatch, Yeti, Australia's Yowie, and more. There is one other theory that has been put forward by Sir Ranulph Fiennes in his book The Headless Valley, quote, "We heard tales of Spanish galleons shipwrecked on the rocky coast of British Columbia with cargoes of apes. The theory was that some of these apes escaped to shore and headed inland. The long winters killed off all but a few who, finding hot, sulfurous springs somewhere in the Nahanni region, survived over the years and were the cause of the various decapitations." Unquote. Actually, can't believe I've gotten this far into the podcast and not mentioned the whole Headless Valley thing. Part of the mystery of the valley, at least what caught my attention when looking into subjects for Canadian History After Dark, was the mention of the Valley of the Headless Men, which is one of the names for the Nahanni Valley. It turns out that oftentimes when someone goes missing or dies in the Nahanni Valley, they are found minus their head. At least that is the legend. There have been many people who have spent time in the valley without having anything like this happen. But I figured I should at least take this moment to address it. Back to the Nakani. The story of the wild creature that stalks the north reminds many of a story coming from Ojibwe and Cree-speaking nations, the Wendigo. Similar descriptions of the appearance, cannibalistic nature, and more are very similar. Are the two connected? We don't know. It is worth noting the Wendigo comes from the Great Lakes and Plains region, while the Nakani comes from the subarctic. The stories of the na-dene, passed down over generations, have created this mythos of the Nahanni Valley. And in many cases, there have been hints of it being much more than just campfire stories told to people to keep from straying from the rest of the group in a dangerous wilderness. As is the case anytime stories are passed down over long periods of time, a few things are added and a few things taken away, but the kernel of truth in the story remains. There very was likely a nation called the Naha that inhabited the valley, and now they are no longer there. The mystery is where they went. Myself, I personally believe the theory that they migrated to the south to become the Navajo, as the most likely of the theories. After all, it's a pocket of the na-dene language, thousands of kilometers from the other speakers of the language. As for the Nakani, I can't say I believe it exists or don't believe it exists. This is the same way that I look at other cryptids of the world, or even things such as UFOs or aliens. We can't say for certain they do exist, but you can't dismiss it out of hand. I mean, there was a species of fish thought to be extinct for millions of years until one was caught in the Indian Ocean around 60 years ago. The whole world is a very mysterious place, and there's so much more that we have to learn about it. So we can't just dismiss the legends of cultures because it sounds outlandish. Now, there is so much more to the mysteries of the Nahanni Valley, and we've really just scratched the surface. We'll be coming back to the Nahanni Valley in the coming weeks. And there are tropical valleys, caves, disappearances, and much more to talk about. Now, coming up this Sunday on Canadian History with Stephen Wilson, we will be continuing our series about the expulsion of the Acadians. And we will look at the time period of conflict between New England and New France in the late 17th century and early 18th century, and how Acadia fell under British rule. Next week on Canadian History After Dark, we have a few ideas in the works, but we haven't exactly decided on where to go. There is the possibility of continuing with our look at the Nahanni Valley. However, there are a few tales from Saskatchewan that I want to look at as well. We will see which one we'll be working with by the coming weekend. And another shout out to the work by Hammerson Peters. His book, Legends of the Nahanni Valley, has been an invaluable resource for this episode. You can find the book on Amazon, and it is well worth the price. You can also check out the website mysteriesofcanada.ca, where there are a number of great articles posted by Peters. Like and follow us on social media. This includes Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Every day we bring you our This Date in Canadian History feature, plus a lot more. Check out our YouTube and become a subscriber. We will be bringing more and more video content in the coming weeks. Visit our website, canadianhistorypodcast.ca. There you can find articles, blog posts, transcripts, and more. You can also support the podcast with donations or by purchasing merch. We have mugs and more available, canadianhistory.ca. And follow along the podcast on your favorite platform. You can also find us on podcastville.ca. We bring you 2 episodes a week. One is Canadian History After Dark, and the other is our ongoing anthology series that looks at various events from Canadian history that may not be as well known nationwide as they are regionally. And thank you for listening to Canadian History After Dark.